Welcome back to another episode of Full But Not Finished. I'm your host, Stephanie Michelle. And when this podcast slash YouTube video airs, I will be in Florida with my entire nuclear family. My family of origin is what I mean to say. My mom, my dad, my sister, my brother, and their families. And so by then it will be safe to announce that we are celebrating my father's 80th birthday, even though he's only turning 79. But my mom really wanted to surprise him, and it's almost impossible to surprise my dad. So she figured she'd do it a year early since he wouldn't be expecting anything then. This is what's on my mind. And I was thinking about how the holidays are upcoming and family events are right around the corner. And in my binge eating recovery group, we are talking about how to handle comments from family diet culture that exists in families, whether or not it's a holiday season. And because I'm coming up on this literally next week, it's just been on my mind. And I was thinking about the ways that I have struggled and still struggle with family, because more than any other trigger, I think that when we're around our family of origin, we're the most likely to be regressive. That means in behaviors potentially with our symptoms of restricting and eating and binging and body image issues, but also mood. I personally notice that even though I don't binge or restrict anymore, I'm not compulsively exercising anymore, I'm not eating in secret in the garage anymore, I still have parts of myself emerge a lot when I'm around my family, and it remains probably the most potent area of self-development, except for parenting, that I still work on. But one of my clients and I were talking about parts, and we were looking at her parts. I am not an IFS therapist. IFS is Internal Family Systems, which is a popular brand of parts work, although parts work is old and tried and true kind of way of psychologically looking at ourselves. But for anyone unfamiliar with the concept, so parts work looks at the different parts of us that emerge in certain situations, and maybe they're younger parts, like our inner child could be a part, or our inner adolescent, or our inner rebel. These are parts of us that aren't necessarily who we are in our most whole state or our most regulated state, but they do emerge during times of conflict to help protect us, and they all serve a purpose. And a lot of times we get upset at our parts. I think we have a lot of opinions that our parts are self-sabotagers and that they are, they sort of ruin everything, or they prevent us from being our best self. But parts are really there to help. They're just the ways that we've learned to protect, to manage, to keep ourselves in contact with society and with our families in the best ways that we knew how at the time. And sometimes those parts reemerge and get stronger when we're around the places in which they developed, because those were the reasons they developed. So for myself, I can tell you that when I'm around my family of origin, I sometimes act in ways that I'm not proud of, in terms of I just don't feel as connected to myself. I feel like I get more snarky. I get definitely more of a chip on my shoulder. I can almost feel it, like in the moment. I'm like, oh, I don't like the way that I'm being right now. But it's because I'm being activated, right? And when we're around family, I think our family also becomes activated too. I think that we're all like this for one another. And so I was thinking about going away next week, being around my family and managing, like, how have I experienced my most regressive parts, and to talk about some of those today, because I think some of you will resonate with them. And also what parts I bring with me on trips like this, because it represents part of the new ways that I cope, or the new versions of myself that I know my older parts or my more regressive parts might need. So whether you're thinking about this in terms of how to manage diet culture talk or body image discussions around a dinner table, whether that's around the upcoming holidays or just in your life at large, this episode offers how to relate to your family and maintain your own sense of groundedness through the lens of parts. Okay, everybody's favorite, it seems, or the one that we love to hate, is the rebel. So it's interesting about my own personal experience with the inner rebel is that I didn't actually have one until I was an adolescent. So my rebel tends to be quite adolescent. She's really kind of indignant and inherently disconnected from the rest of the family, because She believes that she's the only one that sees things in a certain way, or she's the way that she sees things is the right way, and wanting everybody else to see things that way and to not be pushed into compliance or to be pushed into family norms that she doesn't agree with. I really love my inner rebel, to be honest with you. My inner rebel has caused much dissent in my body and in my mood and in my behavior over the years. But I've come to understand my inner rebel as somebody who is really just trying to stand up for what she sees that maybe other people don't see. I do believe my inner rebel is actually very, very strongly connected to my inner binge eater. And like my compassion towards my inner rebel, I have a compassion towards my inner binge eater and see them both as proponents of individualism and fighting for me in ways that simply just ran in conflict with the more conscious part of me, the more front facing, socially acceptable parts of me. So, for example, binge eating is not exactly the most productive way to get my attention. It does get my attention, which is why I think the rebel always used it. But it also created a lot of strife for me and got in the way of other parts of me. And that is admittedly the frustrating piece about the rebel, because the rebel really doesn't care about any of the other parts, or at least she doesn't really understand another way of getting her communication through, except to speak through value systems that will get attention, and that's what brings notification to the system. So whenever I was around my family, and still to this day, when there is a clash of values or when stories come up that make me bristle, and to be clear, I don't believe that I'm always right the way that my rebel tends to think she is. I think all of my family members have rebels, and they all have parts of them that think that the way they see something is not seen by the others. And to remember that we all have our own perspectives. But our inner rebel tends to think that our perspective is the only right perspective. And admittedly, like I have that. I have that part of me that really does think that. And I can be mindful enough to understand that that is not always true, but sometimes I feel like it is. And when I'm with my family and I feel like my values are being minimized or unseen or bulldozed, or there's simply two different people in the family system that act differently, that have different ways of doing things, that have different perspectives on health or food or parenting or work, my rebel can get activated. What used to happen here is that in the absence of really being able to put words to that, because the things we're talking about here aren't like, nobody's walking around being like, well, you have just activated the part of me that clashes with your value system, and I really need to speak up for myself. Like, nobody's doing that. Nobody's even thinking like that. These are so embedded in the fabric of dynamics that it seems like silly to even think of it like this. So instead, in order to get expression, the rebel would not communicate and not even be able to communicate to myself, but simply act. The rebel would just act out, and very much paired up with anger here. What happened there was usually a symptom. So the rebel would act through food, either through restricting and rejecting food, and or moving towards it and eating it all and finding myself, not wanting to eat the family dinners, but needing to eat my own separate salads because that's what I wanted to do and that's what made sense for me. And then later finding myself in a tray of mom's brownies because ultimately the restriction caught up with me, and or the brownies felt like the next rebellion. The rebel does often come up in family dynamics. And one of the ways that I sense her presence is the way that I feel anger. And so if you're somebody who doesn't like anger or isn't comfortable with anger, you might want to look at, does your inner rebel feel like they don't have permission to be there because there usually is an association of anger with rebellion. I have a client who says that anger illuminates the need for justice. And I think it's a beautiful way of thinking about anger, not as a point of aggression, but as a value system. And I see my inner rebel like that. But I do notice that when I sense rebel coming, I sense anger coming. If you notice the energy of your inner rebel rising, you might want to think about that as there's energy running through my body that needs somewhere to go. And in the absence of putting that somewhere, like getting out for a walk, lifting something heavy, even just being able to do some deep breathing or squeezing, there's a lot of somatic techniques that can help process the energy of anger. That energy might end up translating itself through symptoms. The second part that can show up for me sometimes with family is I call my inner victim or my inner despaired. And this is the part of me that is older. It's also adolescent in origin, but takes the opposite action of the rebel and just folds, just collapses, just feels really hopeless and helpless about the same triggers, maybe about being misunderstood, about not connecting, about feeling dismissed, about the fact that, for example, families may not change their perspective on food or body hierarchies. My inner victim, and I pair it with despair because they often went hand in hand. They're actually kind of different parts, but they really work closely together. My inner victim felt like no matter what I said or did, there was no validation coming. There was no sense of, I feel really seen and heard. In the absence of being able to rebel against the injustice, sometimes we default to collapse because we perceive that we're not going to be able to change anything. And the energy that we give to trying to change something, or even sitting in the resistance of it shouldn't be this way, can eventually become too much energy to hold. And eventually it deflates and we kind of throw our hands up and all of that energy freezes, becoming despair. In despair, I would also be symptomatic. So, depending on which way you lean into restriction or binging, or even with body image spirals, despair can really become the fuel that drives the thoughts, that drive the behaviors, that drive the emotions, and the whole feedback loop goes on and on. My inner victim wanted so badly to be seen, for someone to save me. That was a big theme for me for a long time, is that I think I wanted my mom to save me, to be honest. I think there's a lot of mother wound in the victim. And in no way am I suggesting that these parts are nonsensical or that they don't have perspective. But I would often find that I would get stuck in my inner victim. You may notice your inner victim or inner despair through your body language as well. So instead of with anger, we might notice like a deflation, a kind of disconnection, almost could be a dissociation from the body, just feeling more tired, not really having energy, not feeling inclined to connect with other people. That's the place where we tend to have thoughts that tell us, why bother trying? No one will ever understand us. We're really, really alone. When we're sitting in that place, it's really easy to jump into negative body image spirals, overeating or binge eating, escaping through food, or hypervigilance and control. Because when we're focused on food or controlling something, we don't have to be so focused on the despair. Note here that feeling this way, and if you run into this part, I don't believe that the point is to get rid of it. I don't think that landing in despair, and sometimes when my inner victim, my inner victim comes up a fair amount, even still. And I don't, that is not a deal breaker. That's not a sign that we've failed or like game over. Because again, that's the tendency to keep thinking, see, I'll never get better. I'm so victimy, you know. And I really believe that that's just a phase. It can be just an emotion that passes. And I also like to think about my parts like the way I think about emotions, that they rise and then they fall. And if we start identifying too much with them, that's when they actually take on a life of their own, and then it's hard to get away from them. But if we can just be in our victimhood, in the part of us that feels despair, and recognize, this is where I'm sitting right now. This is the place that I'm coming from. Even in naming that, we create a mindfulness between us and the part. And instead of being that part and over identifying with that part, we can have a self that observes that part. That's going to introduce the concept of choice later when that emotion abates a little bit, when that part's energy isn't so forefront. I call that the invitational window, when a part or a nervous system state or an emotion starts to retreat a little bit and opens the door into what else is here. And if we miss that what else is here because we're over identified with the pathology of the part or the emotion, and we're busy thinking this is never going to end and what's wrong with me that I feel this way, we actually miss that opportunity to say, what else can I do here? What opposite actions can I take? How else can I help myself? The next part that I want to name here is the performer, which is very closely tied to the pleaser. They are different, but they work in tandem a lot of times. So the pleaser is the part of us that doesn't want to cause any trouble, that wants to be known as maybe the good girl still, or somebody who's not going to take up emotional space, somebody who does emotional caregiving for the rest of the family, somebody who's known to have it all together and doesn't create stress in the family. I have a lot of clients where there is this dynamic where they have siblings, and the siblings are the ones that have the issues, quote unquote. And so they've been assigned the role of like the steady one. So sometimes when we're pushing a part of us down that we may perceive as like a darker side, or a part that does need, or a part that doesn't have it all together, in favor of presenting something on the outside, sometimes it causes dissension inside around the parts of us that are feeling like, hey, I actually don't have the energy it takes to pretend. And maybe that's then going to circle back around to the rebel. There's also something dishonest about being a pleaser or performer. It might not be that you're showing a side of yourself that isn't true or real or authentic, but it might be masking shadow sides. There might be a feeling of, I'm showing the palatable parts of myself, but I'm hiding what I perceive to be the less palatable parts of myself, which has a tone in it of self abandonment. If we are perpetually hiding parts of ourselves, we're also in essence a little bit suggesting to others and also to ourselves that there are parts of me that aren't good enough and they're rejectable, which again relegates them to the shadows. And I don't know about you, but my shadow parts always have a way of contacting my inner rebel to let them know that they have been locked up. Inner pleasers or performers might also find themselves compromising their own values. Somebody wrote into the podcast recently to say, I'm really distressed at the work I've been doing around body image and weight neutrality and the things I know to be true in my own value system. But when I'm around other people, I find myself just kind of going along with their jokes, going along with their diet culture talk. And I'm not standing up to them. I'm not saying anything. I'm not dissenting in any way. And while that's a very complicated protective mechanism, perhaps that's going on there, that isn't a call to castrate oneself or, assume that you have the wrong values or that you're not strong enough. There is a feeling that happens when we feel unable to bring our authentic self to the table. When we just kind of go along with the diet culture jokes as we always have, when we don't speak up for the things that we believe in. And to remember that there's a difference between picking your battles and hiding your authenticity. So in some cases, there may be a choice of, I'm not even going to go here with the family. I'm not going to speak out against the jokes they're making because I know it's not going to land anyway. That's a different thing it feels like a choice. But when we're in performance or pleasing mode, it feels like a default. It feels like we didn't actually choose to not say something. We just couldn't find ourselves or didn't feel safe enough in ourselves to speak up. And none of this is a call to pathologize yourself or any part of yourself for doing what it needs to do in a moment. The call is to investigate and to look at what parts of myself are here and how does their need for safety show up in my behaviors. The last one that I want to name is the educator. And this is the part that may have developed more recently as you've been learning about intuitive eating or learning about weight stigma. And you want to share that with people. You want to let people know in kind of a way that, again, can feel really empowering and like finally speaking up for yourself that I actually don't believe these things. And maybe there is more confrontation in the educator. Maybe the educator wants to inform the family that these jokes don't feel right to me anymore and I don't want to hear them anymore. I don't want you to speak about these kinds of things in front of my children. I want to break these generational cycles. And in so many ways, the educator is an allied, evolved part of us, the part that might be for the first time able to speak up. And in my experience, my inner educator became kind of like a conflicted part of me. I had a client who created a spreadsheet of all of her parts. And what I loved about what she did with it is she didn't make it like a black and white, these are my good parts and these are my bad parts. She actually had this column down the middle where she listed several parts that could lean this way or they could lean this way. So sometimes they were helpful parts and sometimes they were a little bit more unproductive depending on the light that you spun on it. And so my educator would fall into that middle column. My inner educator was, in some ways, this advocate for myself, like a game changer, somebody who is willing to disrupt the status quo in the family, to start pointing out the ways that diet culture has harmed me and my family. But my inner educator also served to disconnect me in the pursuit of trying to educate everybody and get everybody on my team and to get everybody to see things through the lens I saw it through, I developed a little bit of a chip on my shoulder. And maybe I needed to do that. Maybe there's a certain amount of pendulum swinging to one side and really needing to push an agenda that maybe is doing something internally that's for us that we're doing that. And it's coming out through the way that we're speaking to other people. But I started to notice that the more attached I got to getting on that soapbox every single chance and opportunity I get at every single thing that my family said, it always felt like an affront. It always felt like another opportunity to correct a wrong. I started feeling more and more disconnected from the group. This is a tricky one to negotiate because there is such a fine line between falling back into pleasing and self-abandoning in order to stay part of the group. And this is exactly why parts are tricky and nuanced. And so there's this middle ground of being able to know, these things aren't okay with me. These things I need to have boundaries around. And these other places are places where I choose to have what's true for me be true for me and to acknowledge that not everybody in my family is going to think that way. So who comes to help? I have developed parts of myself in more recent years of recovery where I have been working on keeping my eyes on my own plate and maintaining my own body image despite comparisons around me, managing my triggers. I've developed parts of myself who really help out some of those other parts that we talked about in the first section. One of the most helpful parts that I have cultivated around this is my inner anthropologist or my inner witness. So, this is the part of me that I picture with glasses, a notebook, and a pen, because she has not gone digital yet, that stands outside of the family dynamic and just takes notes. So she's aware of all of the systems at play. I wrote a Substack article last week that talks about the different psychological lenses that you can look at a family through that helps us understand why we behave the way we behave. And so the inner anthropologist is looking at things less personally. And this is the key. The anthropologist is able to have that mindful step back to observe behavior patterns, relationships without making it personal, just to see it through the lens of, okay, this person might be saying this, and these people act this way together, or this happens here because of this. And I'm responding this way because of this, and this. It's being able to offer yourself perspective on both your family and on yourself and the dynamics of the two with more compassion through logic and sense and pattern detection. I have a client whose brother is actually the diet culture enforcer in the family. And whenever she goes home and he makes a comment to her sister-in-law, so her brother's wife, my client understandably feels upset. We were talking about her brother's relationship with her father and how this was her father's only son. And as such, there were expectations in the family about, what a son should be and stereotypical gender roles. And in a family of women, the son was expected to be the man. And so whenever there's a family gathering among them, her brother becomes more diet culture driven. And we were discussing the ways in which the system itself might bring that up in him because he's feeling pressures in that moment to be the man because his father is watching. Sometimes being the inner anthropologist is a helpful way of being able to witness that and to be able to say, okay, like I see the dynamics at large going on here. This might have nothing to do with me. And while there still may be emotions around this and understanding why something's happening doesn't always mean that it's okay, the personalization may change. The way that we're able to hold multiple truths may change through being able to be a mindful witness. The second part to bring on board to any family gathering is your nervous system whisperer. So, this is the part of us that is able to detect changes in our own state. And we'll just leave it there for now because we can't be busy managing everybody else's state. But if you can understand your own signals of activation, you might be in a better position to respond instead of react. Sometimes when I am with family and I'm sitting at a table that has a lot of noise, a lot of movement, there's kids running around, there's a lot of chaos in the environment, I become overstimulated. And at times like that, listening to conversations that are also vulnerable or triggering to me are going to be harder to do. So, by being able to pay attention to where my threshold of capacity is, I can also understand where, like, okay, if somebody starts talking about something or if somebody's commenting on food in a way that doesn't feel good to me and I'm overstimulated, my response is going to be much more catastrophic than it might otherwise be, so that I can be aware of, are my thoughts taking me to a place where I'm now believing my own extreme thinking and I'm going towards that despair or I'm going towards that rebellion because I'm overstimulated or my system is in activation more than normal right now. In times like that, I give myself room to get up off the table, to go upstairs, to even just excuse myself to the bathroom or to do some grounding work in my own chair. Like I love the chair pull, which is where you pull the bottom of your seat up and just kind of ground into the chair. And sometimes by paying attention to my own sense of groundedness in my own body, I can kind of let the conversation that's outside of me do its own thing and not feel compelled to move towards it and to let it activate me in ways that I know my system can't really handle right now. When our window of tolerance is more narrow due to decreased sleep, increased alcohol, overstimulation, the impact of travel, and the vulnerability of just being in a family system again, our defenses are going to be higher. Just knowing that has helped me a lot to understand that I don't always have to believe everything that I think. I don't always have to follow every instinct I have towards confrontation or despair. And that given space and time, I may actually have a different perspective. The next part that I have learned to bring on board is my inner humorist. And this one was so hard for me because I don't naturally lean that way. I'm not, I mean, I can be humorous actually, but when I'm intense and when I'm in my defenses, I am not lighthearted. It's very difficult to get me into a lighthearted place. And so I have a lot of resistance towards humor. But humor is housed in the part of the nervous system where we connect. And if we are constantly pushing away connection and humor and the ability to soften in our systems, then we're going to remain more and more disconnected, which can inspire all of our defensive parts to come up and will invite our symptoms to return. So, my inner humorist sometimes pairs up with my inner, how would I call this? My inner opposite actioner. So, or anyone familiar with DBT might know opposite action is choosing to do the thing opposite to what the instinct is. For example, if my instinct is to bark back at my father when he brings up politics, my opposite action might be to actually lighten the mood by making a joke about something else. My inner humorist is often my opposite action go-to because that tendency to keep things serious and to stay in defensive mode and to stay vigilant is so strong. When I can become more flexible and introduce the idea of softening through laughter, through humor, as my daughter would say, through it's not that deep, I am inviting a warmer, more connected part of my nervous system to come on board. And that's not only helpful for the family dynamic and for group cohesion, but for yourself. It's the regulated part of our nervous system where we can actually, again, zoom out and be able to see what's going on and being able to tend to ourselves and take better care of ourselves. Being humorous is not always minimizing something. It's not always a call away from advocacy. Sometimes it is the advocacy. The next part I bring is the doer. And so this is the part of me that instead of sitting there and ruminating and thinking and like working myself up about conversations or what they said or what they did or how they think of me here or there, I just do things with my hands. So I might start washing the dishes or go upstairs and clean up the kids' stuff or make the bed or run to the grocery store or take the dog for a walk. Using your hands, not necessarily literally, but to do things, to do small tasks that have beginnings, middles, and ends, go a long way to keep moving, the keep moving mentality. If you're somebody who tends to be around family and get stuck, you get stuck in parts, there might be a lot of overthinking going on, a lot of overanalysis, potentially also a lot of overfeeling. Doing is getting into the body. Doing helps us keep moving. This is not a call to minimize or suppress. This isn't let's keep doing so we pretend that didn't happen, but it's so that we're not getting stuck in the rumination and overanalysis of what happened. There have been many times where I have been in a situation with a family member that has, that I start to get that way. I start to get, some chest tightening. My hands start to, like, like my jaw gets a little stiff, and I know that there's a path I could take where I could really work myself up more. by thinking about that, by engaging with that, to turn towards my inner doer and to have my inner doer say, why don't we go over here and accomplish this? Because that's not a productive place to be right now, can actually help bring me out of that mindset entirely. It's a version of distraction. And while you don't have to not think about something, or you don't have to put it away, and maybe we can save it for later and have a conversation with a safe person about it at another time, or text a friend about it at another time, the doing in the moment can help diffuse the energy or the charge of the situation in real time. And finally, a part that I have brought with me is what I call my inner young Pueblo. And for anyone who follows young Pueblo or has read his books, he's kind of like that inner grounded adult. And in some family units, we need one. We need an inner grounded adult. In my most regressive moments, I need to become the grounded adult that my inner child needs, that my inner victim needs, that my inner adolescent needs. I need to become the most present version of myself. And at the risk of becoming an educator or overly attaching to this idea of being a grounded adult, and again, that's one of those really fine lines so that we're not also performing that. But my inner grounded adult is the part of me that becomes almost a felt sense of, where am I? Where am I? And when everything else is quieter, how do I find what's true? How can I look at all of the different parts of myself and understand that they're here without judging them, not overly attached to any of them, and really see the experience that I'm in as a moment in time in my life that can offer me more joy if I can open up to it, where I can hold boundaries without feeling scared, and that I don't have to take everything so seriously. That's my version of inner adult, and everybody's going to need a different thing, a different way of meeting their family or themselves around their family. But my inner young Pueblo kind of brings me back to the ground. What parts do you notice coming up for you when you are around your family, both helpful parts or less helpful parts? What parts have you been cultivating more lately, and what parts of you are older that might need help from some of those evolving parts? This is obviously not an exhaustive list. There are so many parts of us that exist. There's so many different ways of conceptualizing parts. There's parts within parts. There's parts that band together to form other group parts. But I like thinking about things through the parts framework because we can recognize that at any given time, a reaction that we're having or a way that we're feeling isn't the entirety of us. There's a part of us that's feeling something, and that part might sit right next to a completely contradictory part. And there's something about having that mindfulness of being like, this is a part of me and this is a part of me, that helps us understand complexity, and that no one thing is entirely ever running the show, and that we can even recruit other parts to help. One of my favorite quotes is by Walt Whitman, and it is, "We contain multitudes." And I think parts work is the perfect representation of that, because we all have many, many parts, and none of them don't make sense. So let me know what parts resonate most with you, or what parts you would add to the pile. Thank you once again for listening. And if you are interested in working with me, you can find my links below. I am taking clients over the next couple of months for new programs starting in the new year. And also stay tuned for special announcements for upcoming workshops around body image, the nervous system, and hey, maybe even parts.